All right, so we have a lot to cover this morning, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. It's just so wonderful to see everybody's faces coming in and all the different backgrounds. I see people in front of farm landscapes and a pond and with a globe in the background and all kinds of interesting backgrounds today. So it's just really great. I'm Melissa Hoffer. I am the Chief of the Energy and Environment Bureau at the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office. And we're delighted. We have almost 700 people who have registered for today's virtual forum, the critical role of forests in protecting climate and public health. So that's just outstanding. And today's attendees, I thought you'd like to know a little bit about yourselves. Join us from very, very diverse backgrounds. We have a number of representatives from government, private citizens, non-governmental organizations, academia, the private sector, from all across the Commonwealth and beyond. We're thrilled to have such a variety of perspectives and a wealth of knowledge for today's forum. This is a topic, I think, about which so many of us care very, very deeply. So we are all tremendously grateful to you for taking time to be here this morning. We are fortunate to be joined today by a number of Massachusetts state legislatures and their staff and government officials. So I'd like to just take a moment to recognize each of them and thank them for joining us. Senator Walter Timilty, thank you. Senator Jo Comerford and her staff. Senator Mike Barrett and his staff. Representative Denise Provost. Staffers from the offices of Representative Natalie Blaise, Senator Adam Hines, and Representative David Robertson. From the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, we have David Ismay, who is the Undersecretary for Climate Change, Tori Kim, who is the Assistant Secretary and the MEPA Director, and Bob O'Connor, Land and Forests Director. From DCR, we're joined by Jennifer Fish, the Service Forestry Program Director of the Bureau of Forest Fire Control and Forestry, Felicia Hubes, who is the Forest Health Forester and ALB Ground Survey Supervisor, Forest Health Program. From the Department of Fish and Game, Ann Gagnon, the Northeast District Land Agent. From the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, John Ragosin, the DFW Deputy Director, and John Scanlon, the Habitat Program Supervisor. From the town of Arlington's Conservation Department, we have Emily Sullivan and Kathleen Auer, the Health Agent for the town of Agawam. With us from the federal government today are Patrick Rappel, the Regional Wood Utilization Specialist of the U.S. Forest Service, and Mia Monroe from the National Park Service. And from the great state of New Hampshire, we have Chris Skoglund, the Climate and Energy Program Manager, the Climate Change Mitigation Air Resources Division of the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. Thank you all so much. I apologize in advance if I've missed anyone. I'd like to recognize and thank our fantastic team of Attorney Generals here at the Attorney General's Office who made today's event possible. Maria Hardiman, our Director of Digital Communications, Assistant Attorneys General Turner Smith, and Matt Ireland, with whom I work very closely on these issues. Our Policy and Government Division Chief, Alethea Rebello Pradas, and our phenomenal Policy Coordinator, Joella Kose. With that, I just want to briefly touch on logistics for our meeting today to reduce all of the background noise. All of you participants have been muted. We will take some time at the end of the program for question and answer. So as we go through today's program and you hear the presentations, as questions occur to you, please enter them into the chat. And as they're going into the chat, we will be documenting them and I will pose as many as time permits during the Q&A period. We may experience a little bit of a lag in Zoom between presenters, shifting from presenter to presenter, so just bear with us. And our presenters have offered very generously to remain on this call for a few moments at the end of the program for additional questions. So if you want to stay on for a little bit and you have some further questions, please feel free to do that. We will be recording today's program and we'll be posting it later on YouTube, and we'll make sure to get that link out to everybody. With your invitation, you should have received a link to our website that includes the full speaker bios, along with the agenda for today's meeting and the references that were used in support of the speaker's presentations. That link is also embedded in the chat, so you can pull it up now if you'd like to take a look at it. In the interest of time, I'm going to briefly introduce each of our speakers, but suffice it to say that we are very fortunate to have with us today among the world's leading experts on climate change and forest carbon, sustainability, bioenergy, and energy policy. We are really honored, very deeply honored to have each of them with us today. And we're just thrilled that you took the time to join us. So I'd like to welcome Dr. William Mumma, Bill Mumma, who is Professor Emeritus from Tufts University. Bill has been working on these issues since 1988, and I think that's the most important thing you need to know about him. When he served as the first director of the World Resources Institute Climate Program, and he helped to develop the world's very first carbon offset program by forests. Many of you on this call will remember that 1988 is the year that Jim Hansen testified before the Senate, that he was 99% certain that the year's record temperatures were not the result of natural variation, and that the greenhouse effect was caused by human activities and was here. So Bill was among those scientific peers who identified the issue early on and began thinking about ways to mitigate it. Richard Birdsey, PhD, is a senior scientist at Woodwell Climate Research Center. He's a specialist in quantitative methods for large-scale forest inventories. Richard's pioneered the development of methods to estimate national carbon budgets for forest lands from forest inventory data. And Dr. John Sterman is the J.W. Forster Professor of Management at the MIT Sloan School of Management, professor in MIT's Institute for Data, Systems, and Society, and director of the MIT System Dynamics Group and MIT Sloan Sustainability Initiative. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill for the big picture on climate goals and the role of forests. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you very much, Melissa, for organizing this and for making
Bill, you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and for this opportunity, and thanks to all of you who have joined in. The goal of this forum is really for a group of us as scientists to explain something about the connection between the role of forest and protection of climate. As you all know, the Commonwealth and the international community have both set a goal of being basically zero net carbon by 2050. And most of the focus has been on reducing our emissions from buildings and transportation and electricity production. But in order to do that, we have to have forests available to be able to remove the remaining carbon dioxide that we have in the atmosphere, and potentially to get beyond zero net carbon. So let me just begin. This, of course, is just a picture of the what you all know about the greenhouse effect, that the sun's energy comes through the atmosphere as visible light, heats up the Earth, and those red arrows on the right show the Earth radiating heat back towards space. There are greenhouse gases in the atmosphere like carbon dioxide that absorb that radiation, emit half of it back down, and half of it out, and so that's what's warming the planet. This next slide shows the gray line shows the rise of carbon dioxide since 1880 through 2019, and you can see it's accelerating. It's rising more rapidly. The zero line is the temperature increase between 1950 and 1980, and you can see below 1950 it's virtually all below that temperature, and the red bars on the going up show that it's been increasing ever since and accelerating. In fact, all but one of the warmest years on record have occurred since 2000. The only one that's not in there is 1998, which is almost 2000. If we take a longer perspective, these data on carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are obtained from drilling down through the Antarctic ice sheet and finding basically fossil air, air that's been trapped when the snow was laid down. And you can see that it's very periodic. About every 100,000 years, there's a peak in carbon dioxide followed by a dip. The peaks correspond to warm periods, the valleys to ice ages. And if you look over here on the right-hand side, you can see we've been in this warm period for about 10,000 years since the last ice age. And sometime in the early part of the 20th century, we exceeded this maximum level that occurred about 330,000 years ago of 300 parts per million. The value today, current, is July. That's when these data were done. And we're approaching 420 parts per million, which is a lot more carbon dioxide. And the climate treaty that was initiated in 1992 set as a goal to achieve stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And we have not done that. The picture in the upper left was taken last week in California. I've been in contact with my colleagues in Oregon who basically, one of them had to evacuate his home for a week. His home was not burned, but about a third of the town in which he lives, they were destroyed. The middle picture is in Boston in January 2018 when a winter storm surge brought icebergs into the area near the aquarium. That's the T station you see there on the left. And on the right, the same month, someone with oceanfront property was not doing well with these storm surges in Scituate. Bottom left is just precipitation, intense precipitation flooding. I could have done 100 pictures like this. And we see from the map that between 1958 and 2016, the amount of precipitation in the top 1% of precipitation events has increased 55% in New England. So whether that's snow or rain, you're right, it's been snowing and raining harder. In other parts of the world, there are extended droughts. And of course, hurricanes are as much in the news as are the fires. They're getting more intense, they're intensifying faster, and they're creating more damage. In 2015, all the governments of the world, including the US, announced an agreement to try to keep temperatures from rising more than 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And the quote from that is to keep temperatures from rising more than that 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, global net anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions must decline by about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, reaching net zero around 2050. 2030 is just 10 years off, and reducing by 45% in that time period is a real challenge. And the net term means the difference between what we put in and what nature takes out. And so to achieve this goal and any further reductions, which we absolutely need, after all, temperatures are already 1.1 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels. And so going to 1.5 will make things worse, but if we stop there, it'll be less worse than if we keep it going. So we must simultaneously reduce carbon dioxide emissions and accumulate more atmospheric carbon in forests. So let's just take a look at how this works. Every year, a group of scientists publish a paper where they take the latest data and put it all together for us. And the numbers here are the averages for over the past 10 years. And you'll see the circled area on the right shows that there are about 11 billion tons of carbon as carbon dioxide emitted every year, 9.5 from fossil fuels, and 1.5, the orange arrow, is basically primarily from deforestation. It's land use conversions and losses. And so 11 billion, we're emitting 11 billion tons every year, and remarkably, the increase in the atmosphere is only 4.9. And the reason for that is nature is our friend. About 2.5 billion tons are going into the oceans every year, and about 3.2 billion tons of that emission, equal to that emission, are going into the land plants, mostly forests. And there's about another 0.4 billion tons that's probably going into the extended growth of forests. So how do we increase carbon accumulation by forests? Well, a group in Germany led by Professor Erb found that altering forest management would allow global forests to accumulate twice as much carbon as they're now absorbing. William Keaton at the University of Vermont in 2010 determined that specific sites in New England forests were capable of storing between 2.3 and 4.2 times as much carbon as they currently do. That is good news. That's information that we can use. And why does that happen? Well, that was explained in a paper that was published also in 2018 that studied 48 forests around the world, all types of forests, including, by the way, Harvard Forest here in Massachusetts was one of those. The largest 1% of trees in mature and older forests comprise 50% of forest biomass worldwide. That means 1 out of every 100 trees, the biggest one, stores half the carbon because biomass is half carbon. So half the carbon is being stored right now in these trees. We do need to reforest areas that have been cut over, and we do need to do afforestation, which is planting trees elsewhere, but we also need to practice proforestation. And proforestation is growing forests to reach their ecological potential for carbon accumulation in wood and soils in the absence of human interference to meet the goal that we have set for ourselves. And some people argue, well, because we have to reduce our emissions, let's cut down these older trees and plant younger, faster growing trees. But these will never surpass the carbon accumulation of slower growing larger trees. They just can never catch up in the year that we have to have it done because they have to reach that size. We already have it stored. Let's not release it if we don't from these larger trees. So proforestation stores more carbon than managed forests producing wood products. This was a study done in 2010. And it shows about, whatever that is, about 8 different ways that forests can be managed. The light color is the amount of carbon that's in the wood products. And you can get up to nearly, close to half of what you cut into wood products, but then you don't have as many trees growing. That's at the left-hand side of this figure. If you allow trees to keep growing, there are no wood products produced, and you get more carbon stored. So there are all kinds of possibilities in between these two examples. So where is the carbon from harvested forest? In a study that was done by the US Forest Service in 2016, they found that about 15% was from damage, insects, fire, wind, drought, land conversion. But 85% of emissions was from the harvesting process. Because not all of what gets harvested actually even gets into products. It's usually somewhere around half, sometimes less, sometimes more, depending on the species. And if you look at the numbers that are in this article, the total emissions from harvesting exceeded the total emissions from commercial and residential building sector in the United States. So that's a lot. In another study just last year, Tara Hutterberg, who's at the School of Forestry at the University of Idaho, studied Oregon, which has really well documented exactly how much carbon was in the forest when the industry started in 1900 and where it was in 2015. And the finding was that 19% of the original carbon that was harvested is in long-lived wood products. 16% is in landfills, and 65% of it is in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So what this illustrates is the incredible legacy from past harvesting that is still in the atmosphere, because the carbon dioxide that we emit today, a significant fraction of it will still be there, not just 100 years from now, but 1,000 years from now. And the temperatures that we peak at will remain for longer than that period, unless we start removing it. Here's an unexpected source of forest land conversion. I'm living now out in Berkshire County, and this is North Adams, near where I live. And this has been a highly controversial practice of the 17 of the 33 solar installations in Berkshire County required clearing forest as of July 1st of last year. And using Google Earth, a group of people have done an analysis, and they found that for this particular case, which you can see the picture on the left, the Google Earth image on the right, the cleared area exceeds the solar panel area by threefold, by a factor of 3. And so there's a lot more carbon lost here in clearing than just the area of the panels, which a lot of people use for their calculations. And ironically, just a few miles away is a cleared strip mall where the grass is just growing up through the asphalt parking lot that could have hosted this particular site. So furthermore, there's no need to cut forests for solar in Massachusetts. We have plenty of areas, and those should be used definitely first. And it's essential that we have more solar panels, but we don't need to be cutting forests. And one of the
Bill, I just want to give you the high sign that we should probably bring your presentation to conclusion and transition to Richard.
I'm right here.
Thank
so
you.
This creates NIMBY, and there are all these services provided, and we just need to have two possibilities I propose. One is a forest reserve for carbon ecosystem services and industrial production forest with longer harvest rotation intervals. And this is a picture I took last winter, the end of the winter. These trucks are rolling out of our forest right now and heading to Quebec with the trees that we need for storage. So we just need to let more trees grow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. And thank you for the concept of pro-forestation, which I think we'll probably hear more about from Richard. Richard, take it away.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, just making sure. A lot of things to click here. Hello, everyone, and it's really an honor to have a little time to talk with you about natural climate solutions and some ideas about some options that might be considered in the state of Massachusetts. So here's a look at the U.S. forest sector as a starting point. Think a little bit about what's going on nationally, picking up on some of Bill's initial global slides. In order for the US to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, there is a need to have a land sink of about 800 million tons per year, and the negative number here indicates carbon dioxide that moves from the atmosphere into the land. The current land sinks about 600 million tons per year. However, projections by the U.S. Forest Service suggest that this will decline to about half of that amount, or to minus 300 million tons per year, which means that we need to take some actions nationally to increase this sink by about another 500 million tons per year. So that's really quite a challenge, and how are we going to get there? I'm going to take a little look at some of the national options and then zoom in to some things that could be considered for the state of Massachusetts. This slide has a list of the kinds of actions that are considered both globally and nationally to increase the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or to decrease the emissions from the land. And there's three broad categories. There's reforestation of agricultural lands, there's improved forest management, and then a set of other activities that are typically considered. And the bars in the chart in the middle give a range of how much could be accomplished from these different activities in the United States based on a national analysis, largely involving forest inventory data that collected annually by the U.S. Forest Service on more than 100,000 sample plots, remote sensing analyses, and a fair bit of computer modeling to simulate how forests respond and how the carbon cycle is affected by changes in management practices. So you can see there's quite a range of numbers shown here. It equals, if you, the range is between 600 and 1,500 million tons per year. We need about 500. And so what this presents is a menu of options that could be considered by policymakers in order to achieve the extra 500 million tons of sequestration necessary for the United States. So it's not going down. There we go. I want to take a look, closer look at Massachusetts forests now. So I have a couple of slides that just review some of the data and some of the trends that are going on in Massachusetts. First, just to start with the chart on the bottom right, it shows the area of Massachusetts forests by age classes. And you can see that most forests in Massachusetts are middle-aged, ranging from roughly 45 to 105 years old. And you compare that with the top graph, which shows how the carbon stock in forests changes over time. Most of those forests still have a long ways to go before they get old. The forests around 100 years old could probably grow another 100 years. Those that are around 50 years old could grow for another 150 years. Of course, this assumes that conditions don't change so drastically because of climate or other factors that this typical pattern would not be achieved. Over on the left, just some statistics. The timber volume, both the timber volume and the carbon stocks are increasing in Massachusetts. Growth rates are greater than the loss of forests to harvest plus deforestation. Actually, the ratio of growth to harvest is about 4.8, meaning that the forests are growing almost 5 times faster than they are being harvested. That's one reason why forests of Massachusetts are a significant carbon sink of nearly 5 million tons of carbon dioxide per year, which, by the way, is equal to roughly 10% of the greenhouse gas emissions from using fossil fuels. Well, the trees outside forests are also included in that 10%. Trees outside forests add another 2.2 million tons of CO2 per year, which is actually quite a remarkable amount, and I think reflects the urban and suburban nature of a lot of the state of Massachusetts. But there's a lot of trees in those areas, and they're doing very well. And as I mentioned, most forests are middle-aged and can continue to grow for decades. Massachusetts pretty much has the highest carbon density in the Northeast. It's about 3 times that of Maine. Of course, Maine is a much more industrialized state with respect to forestry. I said earlier, the growth to harvest ratio in Massachusetts is about 4.8. In Maine, it's about 1.4. So that reflects the much more intensive forest management that takes place in Maine. Another interesting statistic is that forests of Massachusetts, the carbon dioxide sink is roughly twice that of the United States average. Of course, the United States is a big country. You can see and hear what's happening in California and other areas of the West that where forests are switching in many areas from being a sink to being a source. But still, Massachusetts forests have a very special place. They're growing very well for the most part and contributing significantly to both the state and the national needs for sequestering carbon. A little more about Massachusetts forests. If you look at the inventory data in the blue bars, the amount of carbon dioxide being taken up by Massachusetts forests has actually been increasing each decade for the last 30 years, which is a pretty remarkable statistic. And not all states, in fact, very few states could make that claim. A recent study, in fact, it was so recent, it was just released a few days ago from the long-term measurements at the Harvard Forest, indicate a number of reasons why Massachusetts forests are growing faster. There's, of course, still a lot of regrowth taking place after land that was that came back from agricultural use, and some from the hurricane in 1938, additional regrowth there, as well as a shift to more oak species. And oak seems to be really driving a significant part of that increase. The climate is getting warmer and wetter. The growing seasons are getting longer. There's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which acts as an enhancement to growth. And then there's been some declines in air pollution and acid deposition since the days of the National Acid Precipitation Assessment Program in the 1980s. And so all of these factors are hypothesized to be contributing to the increased growth. In contrast, look at the projections. Now, these are downscaled from the national projections by the Department of Agriculture, Forest Service, and I think they're overly pessimistic. But what's behind those projections are a continued loss of forest area, basically continued deforestation, coupled with reduced areas of new forest because we're running out of land that can be afforested. Increased harvest is projected for timber products and biofuel. And then there's an assumption embedded in the models that some of the forests are growing older and slower. But if you look at the inventory data, there's really no indication that that's actually taking place. And I think the modeling assumptions are much too pessimistic about how forests can continue to grow in the future. So I think those projections are a little bit overly pessimistic. But if you look at the difference between the projections and the inventory data, Massachusetts would need to make up about 2 million tons per year somehow in order to keep up with the pace of recent history. And here's a couple of maps from the state of Massachusetts, produced by Wayne Walker at the Woodwell Climate Research Center. Just gives a nice visual of the forest, the highest carbon density. Shown on the left map is in the area of the Quabbin Reservoir. But in contrast, the eastern part of the state has a lot higher rate of increase in carbon, whereas the western part is where a number of decreases are taking place. The loss of forest biomass is primarily due to deforestation and the selective harvesting that takes place around the state. One interesting thing I'll point out on the right-hand graph is the track of a tornado in south central Massachusetts is clearly visible as a loss in carbon density. And in the lower right, I just wanted to mention one example of a project in an area north of Boston, the Vale development, where a tract of about 25 acres is scheduled to be converted to a shopping mall and some homes. And there's a lot of those little projects happening. Deforestation in Massachusetts is likely to be somewhere between around 10 and 14,000 acres per year. So a lot of little projects like that add up to having a pretty significant impact. Okay, this is just about my last slide. I'm going to take a little time to work through this. So these are estimates of the potential reduction in net carbon dioxide emissions from forestry activities in Massachusetts. They're downscaled from the national estimates I showed earlier. However, that downscaling was based very much on the specific forest inventory data that's available for the state of Massachusetts. So the top activity, or the activity that has the largest potential, is really two activities at least: extending rotation lengths, that is allowing forests to grow a little longer before they're harvested, and then the proforestation that Bill talked about, which is protecting forests and allowing them to grow larger trees. These two activities could have immediate benefits. They offer, depending on how a policy were designed, they could offer both protection plus continued provision of products. I note that the accounting is a little bit tricky here. There are a number of factors that need to be considered. Leakage refers to the fact that if harvesting were reduced because of extending rotation lengths, one might need to account for increased imports of timber from other areas. So that would tend to reduce the benefit a little bit. Additionality addresses what might happen to the forest if no action were taken. And then substitution refers to the any benefit that would occur from using wood instead of other products like concrete and steel. So there's a lot going on in that first activity. This is not a prescription of things that could be done. These are things that could be investigated further with a more detailed analysis, as well as consideration of the impacts of policy. Reduced deforestation is pretty straightforward. There's an immediate benefit, but as mentioned, it's comprised of many, many small projects that are affected by decisions made at a local level. And so, you know, that's certainly a very effective area to consider. Might require some coordination across levels of government to have happen. Restoring the productivity of degraded forests. There's a lot of areas that are harvested for just the best trees are taken, often referred to as high grading, without much consideration of what's left behind. And as a result, these forests tend to be understocked with trees, and so they're not growing as fast as they could. It's a great area where some of the folks who are developing what's known as exemplary management practices could really be applied to change these areas from what I might refer to as rather poorly managed to being some of the best managed forests and delivering a lot of benefits to the state. Reducing emissions from harvested wood products refers back to Bill's slide showing how much is emitted during the harvesting, processing, use, and disposal of wood. If there are ways to minimize those emissions, for example, by ensuring that waste wood is stored away perpetually in sealed landfills, then there could be some benefit. This is considered sometimes a frontier technology since there's not been a lot of effort put into this aspect yet. And then finally, there's three activities.
If we could address the last three activities maybe in response to a question so that we can be sure to have enough time for John's presentation.
Yeah, this is essentially my last slide, and so I'll just very quickly note that there are a few other activities. They maybe don't have as large potential as the others, but they could be locally very, very important. The total of all these activities is about 3 million tons carbon dioxide per year, which would be more than enough if all were enacted to reverse the projected decline. So really, that's it for me. I always like to show these photos of the dioramas that give us a little history of how forests in that area have evolved and what they might look like in the future. So thanks very much, and I hope to hear from others if any questions come about. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That's terrific. And John. Just unmute yourself, John.
Well, good. Thank you, Rich and Bill and Melissa in the Attorney General's office for organizing this. I'm going to focus on a different issue, and that is bioenergy from wood. So the question here is, why not use some of our forest resources for bioenergy? Since, after all, wood is a renewable resource. And unlike the fossil fuels, when you burn a tree, it's possible that a new tree will grow in the forest and remove the carbon that you've added to the atmosphere from combustion. So the question is, does wood bioenergy help cut greenhouse gas emissions in time to meet our climate goals, which, as Bill pointed out, a 50% cut from current levels by 2030, followed by essentially net zero emissions globally by mid-century? The science is very clear. The answer is no. Now, why is that? It's intuitive that wood as a biomass ought to be better than fossil fuels. But the answer is no, and the reason is basically very simple. The carbon dioxide per unit of useful energy from wood are much higher than fossil fuels. 25% more CO2 per BTU of useful energy than fuel oil, 50% more than propane, and 75% more than natural gas. And of course, natural gas is the dominant source of electricity and the marginal source of electricity, along with some renewables here in Massachusetts. So the very first thing that happens if you use wood in place of any of these fuels is you immediately increase carbon dioxide emissions, increasing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and worsening climate change. Now, it is true that your forests might regrow, but regrowth takes time and it is not certain. And in the meantime, you're continually worsening climate change compared to what it would have been otherwise. We do have an alternative, and that alternative is much greater deployment of energy efficiency and renewables. They are faster, cheaper, and safer ways to cut our emissions, and along the way will create jobs, improve our health, and promote sustainable prosperity. So that's the argument in brief. Now let's drill down and see what the basis for this conclusion is. So here you see the supply chain for wood bioenergy. We harvest trees from our forests. We transport that wood to a chip or a pellet plant where it's processed into a form that can be used for electricity generation or thermal applications. It is then transported to the power plant where it's burned. Here's the CO2 in the atmosphere. Now let's look and see, where are the emissions all the way along that supply chain, and where are there opportunities for reductions? Well, harvesting generates emissions because fossil fuels are used to harvest that wood, and there's disturbances of the soil and therefore additional emissions of carbon dioxide and methane from decay and loss of soil carbon. There's obviously fossil fuel emissions involved in transporting that wood to the power plant. It takes quite a lot of energy to process the wood into chips or pellets, not just to run the equipment, but also for drying. Raw wood has a great deal of moisture. If you don't take care of that, it burns very inefficiently. Additional emissions to transport the chips or pellets to your power plant. And then the big source is when you burn that wood, you're injecting all the CO2 in that wood into the atmosphere. So emissions all the way along the supply chain. The only opportunity for reducing carbon dioxide as a result of this is if the forests you've harvested to supply the wood regrow faster than they would have otherwise. That's the only way you get any reduction in atmospheric carbon dioxide from the use of wood bioenergy. And as I say, that takes time and it's not certain. So let's look at some data. Here we have data from the Forest Service, which shows for 3 of the common types of forests in Massachusetts and New England, what happens to the stocks of carbon on that land when those forests are harvested. So what you're seeing is, for example, the green band. Let's focus on the top graph, New England's maple, beech, and birch forests dominated by those species. We have quite a lot of those. We also have oak hickory and oak pine forests and some other types as well. They all show basically the same dynamics. So let's focus on maple, beech, birch as typical. The green line is the stock of living biomass in the trees and the plants after a harvest and as that forest regrows. And the brown line is the amount of carbon in the soils after the harvest. And you'll notice that that carbon in the soils and the dead organic matter actually declines for decades after the harvest. This is because the bacteria and fungi in the soils continue to respire and generate CO2 and methane that goes into the atmosphere, but the carbon that comes from living biomass and enters the soil, that has been reduced. And so the stock of carbon in the soils is declining in the same way that a bathtub that's draining faster than it's filled will see the level of water decline. So when you harvest from your forest, you're taking carbon that's on the land and in the soils and you're putting it in the atmosphere. That speeds up climate change. Now these data curves are optimistic because they assume that along the way, you're not reharvesting and converting this land to other uses, such as development for commercial, industrial, or housing purposes. Also assumes no fire or disease or insect pests like the emerald ash borer or damage from extreme weather. And all 4 of those are growing worse as a result of climate change. So it takes over a century and you're still not fully recovered, as Bill pointed out. Continuing to allow those forests to grow would substantially increase the stock of standing carbon on the land and in the soils. So what I and my colleagues, Dr. Lori Siegel at Climate Interactive and Professor Juliet Rooney-Varga at UMass Lowell have done is we've developed a simulation model that integrates the forest regrowth dynamics you just saw with the life cycle impacts that we showed you a minute ago to ask the question, what happens to carbon in the atmosphere when you substitute wood for different fossil fuels? These papers are publicly available and the references have been posted online. So imagine we built a wood-powered electric generation station here in Massachusetts. Every year it's now going to use wood to generate electric power, and that would happen instead of, in this example, using natural gas, again, the dominant source of power and the marginal source in much of Massachusetts. So the very first thing that happens is the amount of carbon in the atmosphere from burning that wood is going to go up compared to using natural gas. To make it simple, let's just focus in this graph on what happens to the wood you burn in the first year. Every year you operate that power plant, you're going to be putting more carbon into the atmosphere than is being removed. But to keep the focus clear, let's just look at the wood you burn the first year. So the very first thing that happens is you increase the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide. That creates a carbon debt because you're now worsening climate change compared to what it would have been. Then what happens is the forests start to grow back and the concentration of carbon dioxide gradually declines. But it takes a long time for that to happen. At some point, indicated right here for this example, where we're harvesting by thinning, not by clear cut, out of this maple, beech, birch forest, you get to the point where the regrowing forest has finally taken up again as much carbon as was injected when you burned that first year of wood. That is known as the carbon debt payback time. And in this simulation, it's almost a century. And these assumptions, which you can see below, are optimistic. We're assuming the wood can be burned with the same efficiency as natural gas. That's generally not the case. We're assuming other supply chain factors from the EPA and National Renewable Energy Lab and so forth. And we're assuming thinning. So almost a century to repay the carbon debt and get back to where you were. But in the meantime, you've warmed the climate more and you've raised sea level and you've contributed to ongoing climate damage. Those harms are not reversed even after that 100-year carbon debt payback time is attained. Any rise in sea level incrementally caused by using this wood is not going to be reversed. These results are optimistic. The payback times are longer if you can burn natural gas more efficiently than wood, which is in fact true, or if the land is clear-cut, reharvested, or converted to other uses. And it's important to notice that it's optimistic because right now, for simplicity, this simulation assumes that the forest is mature. But as Rich pointed out, that's not the case. The typical forests in Massachusetts are middle-aged and only at about half or so of the carbon density that they could attain if they were allowed to continue to grow. So here's a pair of simulations where we look at what happens when the forest is initially more like our actual forests, only 50% mature. The carbon debt payback time is substantially longer. And the reason for that is that the trees in those growing forests would have continued to store carbon but for being cut and burned for energy. So you can see that in a mature forest where we thin, it's 98-year payback time when we're substituting for natural gas. But if the forest is only 50% mature, as is typical of Massachusetts forests, then that same thinning practice increases the payback time to over 120 years. If you clear cut, it's even worse, 125 years payback time if the forest is mature. And in the realistic case where the forest is still growing, you're looking at almost 140 years payback time. We just don't have that time. We have to cut our emissions by about 50% by 2030 and reach approximately net zero by mid-century. Burning trees, burning wood for bioenergy makes climate change worse over at least a century or more. There are other harms from burning wood that happen immediately. For example, burning wood creates ground level pollutants that are dangerous to human health. And that's why 8 major public health and medical organizations that you see listed here have petitioned the government, federal government, to limit or disallow the burning of wood as a source of energy because of the human health impact. Burning biomass creates air pollution that causes sweeping health harms from asthma to cancer to heart attacks, resulting in emergency room visits, hospitalizations, and premature deaths. And of course, that's bad enough, but in addition, it raises healthcare costs, already approximately 19% of the United States economy, and creating a great drag on our ability to grow prosperously. So we can't burn wood as a way to solve our climate problem, but this in no way should be taken as a justification for continuing to burn natural gas or any other fossil fuel, because those are the sources of the climate change that are destroying our prosperity, our health, and putting our lives at risk. The good news is that there are alternatives. And here, complicated chart, but you see over time, over the last 10 years, the costs of the different sources of energy for electricity. What you see is that over the past 10 years, the cost of solar has fallen by almost 90%, wind by 70%, energy storage with lithium-ion batteries by almost 80%. And so for the past few years, wind and solar with storage have become the cheapest source of the energy we need, even cheaper than natural gas combined cycle. So the economically attractive option to generate electricity is now the renewables that generate no carbon in use. Even more important, energy efficiency is far cheaper even than the renewables. So here's a new study just out from the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab showing that the cost to utilities of increasing the efficiency of their customers' homes and businesses is only 40 cents per therm, whereas the cost of providing more natural gas to heat inefficient buildings is $1 per therm. So 60% reduction in costs to deploy efficiency programs. And it would be even more if we switched to electric heat pumps for our heating and cooling. And there are great social benefits of energy efficiency. So for example, every year in Massachusetts, across the Commonwealth, in the winter, the economically disadvantaged and the poor, many of them have to choose between heating and eating. That's immoral, that's wrong, and we can do better. Here's an example from New Zealand, where New Zealand provided energy efficiency upgrades for housing, especially for the poor and low-income folks. And as you can see, the health benefits alone are nearly 4 times the cost of the program. And the program creates jobs across New Zealand. Now, New Zealand is not that different from Massachusetts. They have, we have 2 million more people than they do, but this is a very effective program. So we can enhance environmental justice, social justice, create jobs, create improvements in health, lower our healthcare costs by investing in efficiency instead of in wood bioenergy or even more fossil fuel. So in summary, wood bioenergy worsens climate change for the rest of the century and beyond. We have to cut our emissions much faster and much sooner than that. The reason is there's much more carbon released per BTU of energy from wood than oil, propane, natural gas. And so you immediately increase the CO2 in the atmosphere when you use wood for energy, and that worsens climate change. Regrowth is gradual if it takes place at all, and the climate damage from wood bioenergy is not reversed even if you eventually repay that carbon debt. You also have the harms from the pollution that's generated when you burn wood, and we have better choices, better, faster, cheaper, safer ways to cut our greenhouse emissions, creating jobs, improving our health, and promoting sustainable prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John, and thanks, Bill and Richard as well. We have a ton of really good questions. We're just about at the end of the program, so if you can stay for the Q&A period, please do that. We were going to have a little bit of time for additional Q&A in any event, so I think we'll just sort of flow into that. And the first question we have here is from Christopher Pepe, and it's, how should timber management plans evolve to reduce the carbon lost by the harvesting process? And how will existing land managers be convinced to adopt those practices? Richard, I think that might be best for you, but anyone? Just unmute yourself, Richard.
Okay, there we go. I couldn't unmute. Wow, those are great questions and not particularly easy to answer. Part of the issue about forest management is it's very locally specific. And so, you know, to really develop better forest management practices, I think you need a couple of things. You need a good strategy overall that promotes good forest management. So that's kind of the first thing, you know, just really encourage and incentivize good management as opposed to what I'll call bad management. But what that means locally is it's very dependent on what type of species are there, what's the history of the forest, what threats there are, what types of products could be produced, and whether lands might be better left alone compared with brought into more active management. And those decisions, you know, are going to be made at the local level or the individual landowner level, especially for the private lands. And so that's where the second part of the question really comes into play. How do you incentivize people to really take action? And that's proven to be really quite difficult. I think some of the best programs in the United States have managed to reach about 10% of forest landowners. And that's really due to a couple of things. One is people own land for many, many different reasons, right? And it's not often for timber. People like to hunt, they like to recreate, they like to hike. They like to know there's a few big trees on their property. So all of these things are really dominant, and so you've got a smaller pool of people who are even willing to consider active management of their lands. So, well, maybe I'll stop there. A few things to think about in trying to implement improved forest management.
I guess I might have a follow-up, perhaps for John. How would you see an economy-wide carbon price affecting incentives for more climate-friendly forestry practices?
So that's a great question. A meaningful price on carbon, which can be implemented various ways, is probably among the highest leverage things we can do to address the climate crisis in the United States and worldwide. And of course, we already have a price on carbon here in Massachusetts for electricity and fossil fuels through RGGI, and there's proposals with the Transportation Climate Initiative to extend that to gasoline and other transportation fuels. This is a very positive high leverage policy, particularly if the revenue from that carbon price is rebated to the citizens on an equal per capita basis. That would convert that policy from potentially regressive to progressive, helping the poor and economically disadvantaged who don't use as much carbon energy today and who need the money more than it would help the affluent. In terms of forests, carbon prices are quite tricky because whereas we know exactly how to put a price on carbon, say on gasoline or natural gas, and administer it in a way that prevents cheating and loopholes, it's a lot trickier to measure how much carbon a forest, say, is taking up compared to what it would have otherwise done. And so the carbon accounting challenge here is an extremely difficult one. It may turn out that although a price on carbon is perhaps the one policy we should take with us to a desert island if we can only take one, that it's not enough. And in our other modeling work, we see that this is the case. It's not enough. We're going to need other approaches. And let me just say that right now, around the world, the European Union and the United States are moving in exactly the wrong direction. The European Union declared some years ago that all biofuels are intrinsically carbon neutral on the false theory that regrowth happens immediately and with certainty to offset the emissions from burning those biostocks. That's just not true. The result of that, and the United States has adopted this same policy, the result of that is taxpayers in England and the European Union are paying significant sums, millions of dollars per day, to private companies, electric utilities, to burn trees, pretending that emissions are falling when in fact they are increasing. That needs to stop. And we need to prevent that kind of false accounting from spreading to the state level as well.
Thank you, John. We have for our next question from Heidi Ritchie at Mass Audubon. And Heidi says, New Jersey and Rhode Island have done studies of already developed and altered lands and made interactive maps that help identify where solar should go. For example, on rooftops, parking lots, brownfields, etc. Would it be helpful if Massachusetts had such a plan? What would we be able to do with a map of available areas most desirable for solar, and how could we relate those to specific goals for the amount of solar we need to develop and target the incentives to appropriate locations? So Bill, I think this is something you've thought a lot about, and I'm wondering if you or anyone else, if not Bill, could address Heidi's question. And we have to get you off mute, Bill. Try again.
Okay.
There you are. Oops.
Still muted.
We lost you again, Bill. Come on back.
Again,
There you are.
I'm back now. Okay, sorry. I think it's a terrific idea to have a systematic way with these kind of maps, and with between just using Google Earth as a start is one way we could do this, and then there are other ways as well. For example, the maps that Rich showed of the carbon density in Massachusetts forests, and how it's greater in some areas than in others, and the losses are greater, and we can even see the losses now. So it's John pointed out some of the difficulties, but those difficulties are becoming less because we now have remote sensing that can tell us what we're actually doing. I would just like to add one other thing to the question about paying for this, or having a carbon tax. I think that there are two things. One, public lands could be should be legally protected, I think, as a place for carbon storage and for ecosystem services. That's certainly one place to start. And that's state lands, municipal lands, and so forth. So designating more of those as basically protected, which is the Forest Service designation. Those are lands that could be harvested but aren't because they're legally protected. On private lands, paying people to let their forests keep growing is probably among the cheaper things we can do, the less expensive things. I haven't compared these to John's analysis, but all you have to do is pay 1 cent more than they would get for cutting it down, and you basically have guaranteed that it'll keep growing. And we don't have to look at this as an offset or anything. It's just an investment, just like we are paying people extra for a tax benefit for putting solar panels on their roof. And so there are a lot of ways in which that would benefit the people who don't want to cut their forests. It would also benefit the people who do, because it would probably end up to increasing the prices that they would get from their forests. They wouldn't have the competition from the state lands, and they wouldn't have the competition from other private landholders who would prefer not to cut anyway.
Thank you, Bill. Did anyone else have a response to that question? All right. We've got a question from Chris Skoglund up at New Hampshire DES. What is the risk of climate change to forest health? If Massachusetts is the most carbon dense, how will increasing heat and varying precipitation and novel pests impact the hardwood forests that hold that carbon?
So can I take a quick whack at that? So there's very serious risks. First of all, as the climate warms, the species mix that we have here in Massachusetts and in other places will change. We already see the maples finding it harder to survive here and trying to migrate north, and they will be replaced perhaps by other species. But that disrupts all kinds of ecosystems because we have insects and squirrels and birds and other species that we rely on and enjoy that will no longer find it a habitable or appropriate place to live. And climate change can change the zone of success for these species faster than they can migrate on their own through seed dispersal. In addition, as was mentioned in the question, warmer temperatures lead to increased risks of fire, of insect damage and mortality for trees, and disease, as well as drought and extreme weather that can knock trees down, for example, in tropical storms, hurricanes, and nor'easters. So all of these things make it harder for our forests to continue to be strong carbon sinks, as Rich pointed out. They are today, but are expected to weaken over time.
Thank you, John. Rich, you were going to comment as well, I think.
Okay, sorry. I probably should just stay unmuted. I think among the concerns that John expressed, I'm more worried probably about insect pests than anything, because they really are quite active now in the Northeast. There's a lot of new pests that come in through the ports. There's a lot of ports along the East Coast. And so a lot of pests like hemlock woolly delgid are moving up north from the south. There's emerald ash borer, and others on the horizon. So I think that's one of the biggest threats. Not to downplay the others, but relative to other parts of the country, the Northeast is a little better off because instead of projected drought, which is really hard on trees, the projections show increased precipitation, which is a little easier for forests to adapt to. On the other hand, there could be more windstorms, more hurricanes, and if there are dry periods, and I think this last year there were some fires that aren't that common but showed up in Maine. So the other threats are also there. I think the good news is we're not seeing that in the data yet. So hopefully the data prevails over time and our projections do not.
Let me just add one thing. If we continue to warm, there will be more problems. New England forests are more resilient than almost any other forest. This and the upper Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, are among the most resilient of our forests in this country. We are in a climate emergency where things are changing so rapidly, though, that eventually it could adversely affect the very sinks we're counting on, namely our forests, to remove the carbon. So everything we can do to reduce the net emissions, meaning both our emissions and increase the removal rates, will help us to avoid that worse outcome.
Thank you, Bill. So looking through the questions that have come in, many of them are directed to the sort of tension between the need to rapidly increase our reliance on alternative forms of energy generation, like wind, like solar, and storage as it becomes more cost effective. So we saw John's graph that shows the cost of those things now dropping below the price of natural gas, meaning that they are going to continue to outcompete natural gas and other fossil fuels in the market, which is a really good thing. And yet there is tension here in New England, and particularly in Massachusetts, about the location of the siting of that terrestrial wind resource and of the utility scale solar installations. So a lot of the questions that we're coming in are sort of grappling with that. How do we address that tension? How do we both protect our forests and make sure that we're going to have enough area for installation of the clean energy that we're going to need? And there's a subpart to one of them that I think is important to address too, which is, does forest fragmentation itself have an impact on the ability of our forests to store carbon? So if somebody could help us think about how is the best way for residents of the Commonwealth and for policymakers to think about balancing those two policy goals and interests.
Well, certainly intact forests are better than patchwork forests in just about every way. They will store more carbon both in the trees and in the soils, and they're also much more important for biodiversity. One of the other aspects about biodiversity that people are concerned about is whether or not there are contiguous corridors for both plants and animals to migrate further north. There is a great corridor that runs all the way from basically just north of New York City all the way to Canada, that comes right through western Massachusetts. And it includes the Taconic Plateau, which is one of the most biodiverse areas we have in New England. And so keeping that intact for the biodiversity is important as well. So fragmenting it with with energy projects is not a great idea. On the other hand, there are places where, I mean, out here in Western Massachusetts, we do have some wind power. There's some up on Savoy Mountain. There's some on Brody Mountain. There's the first Jiminy Peak was the first ski area in the United States to install a wind turbine for the electricity it needs to make snow in the winter. Brian Fairbanks, who owned it at the time, just said, you know, I just realized I'm in the business of having snow, and here I am using electricity that's putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that's warming the planet. Doesn't make sense. And so he did that early on, and a lot of other people have followed since. And so I think we can find places. I don't think they certainly don't belong everywhere. And the other thing is, of course, there's this huge potential of offshore wind, which is closest to our high population and industrial areas. And so that does not require destruction of forests at all. And it can be done in a way that has very little impact on sea life or the fisheries. So I think that's certainly a piece of it.
So can I speak to this equity issue, Melissa, that you're raising? And let's just go back to the fundamentals here. Nobody actually needs energy. What people want is a warm home in the winter, cool in the summer, lights on when you need the lights, access to economic, educational, and cultural opportunities, healthcare, and so forth. Nobody needs tons of coal, therms of natural gas, or barrels of oil. You need those services that energy affords. The cheapest, safest, least cost way to provide them is the way we should go, individually and as a society. There is no doubt energy efficiency is the safest, fastest, cheapest way to do that. There's tremendous opportunity here. As I showed you, it's cheaper than even the renewables. And it's distributed all across the country and all across the Commonwealth. And it's absolutely doable. So all three of us, to various extents, have been walking our talk on this. I'll just illustrate with my situation, where I am right now in my home. We did a deep energy retrofit. The home's almost 100 years old. We did a deep energy retrofit 5 years ago, which meant a lot of insulation, much better windows, tightening the building envelope, LED lighting, high efficiency appliances, and we put solar on the roof, not cutting down any trees to do so. Over the past 5 years, we have made almost 50% more energy than we use with zero fossil fuels. Now, I have been privileged enough to be able to afford to do that, but the poor people in communities of color and the economically disadvantaged all across the Commonwealth, including in the Western counties, they need that same opportunity. We can use some of the resources that are currently going into programs that are harming our forests and worsening climate change to create those opportunities, lowering their energy bills. I have no electric bill, no heating bill at all. And Eversource now owes us over $4,000. So I'll be able to run my vehicles on 100% solar power, except I'm a bicycle commuter, so I don't need an electric car. So this is something that would dramatically improve economic welfare, especially for the poor and disadvantaged and communities of color all across this Commonwealth. It's the most cost-effective thing we can possibly do. So I really disagree with the idea that some people promote that if you don't have more energy, you're going to be freezing in the dark. It's just not true.
Right. And I can back that up. I've been living in the zero net energy house for 13 years. And I have enough surplus now to have an electric vehicle, because I do have to have a vehicle to get to some of the places I have to get to. And it's really it is the most comfortable house I've ever lived in. And since I'm nominally retired from Tufts University, I have no bills either. My only bill is the internet, right? And I haven't figured out a way to do that with solar energy, but if I could, I would.
Well, thank you. I just want to thank everyone again. I want to ask our presenters if there are any final remarks you have before I close.
I'd just like to say thanks to everybody for the attention, the great questions, and just a chance to talk a little bit about forests and forestry.
And I'd just like to say that this is that the forests of Massachusetts are a remarkable legacy that we have inherited. We have done, we in the present generation have done nothing to account for what we have inherited. It is a gift to us, and we therefore should take care of them, and they will take care of us. I think that's maybe the best way to say it. We have a remarkable opportunity here to not only make a difference for ourselves and for the future, but actually to be an example for the rest of the country and the world if we do this right. And I think we can do it right, and it will have multiple benefits. In the process, we need the input, not just of scientists like us, but also from forestry scientists, which Rich Birdsey was a forestry scientist at the U.S. Forest Service for many years, and from the foresters who have a lot of experience with our forest, but they've been mostly managing it for timber production, and I just don't think we can afford to have all of it managed for timber production anymore.
Right. So let me just say that if people are interested in following up on alternatives to cutting our forests, they can use our freely available climate solutions simulator called En-ROADS, and you can access it for free through our partner, the nonprofit Climate Interactive, at http n-roads.org. Check it out for yourself. You don't have to take our word for any of this. You can explore which policies are most effective in solving our climate crisis for yourselves. And so let me just end by saying the climate crisis is now so serious and we have so little time that many people give in to despair. They think it's just too late. They think they're too small. They're just one person or one small organization. There's nothing we can do. That's just not true. It's not going to be easy to solve this crisis, but it is possible, and it's going to be worth it. So Melissa, thank you, in the AG's office again. It's been a pleasure.
Yes,
Thank you
very much.
Thank you. I just wanted to really, our deep thanks on behalf of the Attorney General's office to each of our three presenters and to everybody who joined us today. It is perhaps a little known fact, I myself only recently learned it, that pursuant to Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 2, Section 50, Dr. Seuss is the official children's author and illustrator for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So I'm going to leave you with the immortal words of the Onceler in the Dr. Seuss classic, The Lorax. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. So thanks for your care. Thanks for your work. I know so many of you on our call, our Zoom session today, are working very, very hard on these issues. So thank you for your work and your commitment, and let's make it better together. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much.